There was an old man who lived alone in the middle of the forest. He must have been over 60 years old, but nobody knew his real name. Most folks just called him Old Man Tom. He had 3 loyal hunting dogs that kept him company on those long, lonely nights. Their names were I Know, You Know, and Calico. He lived in an old cabin he had built himself, way back in the deep dark woods. It wasn't very big, but just enough room for him and his dogs. The cabin only had one room in it, which was his bedroom, bathroom, dining room, and kitchen. At the far corner of the room was a nice big open fireplace where he could cook his dinner and warm his old bones on those cold winter nights. Old Man Tom loved hunting, fishing, and the great outdoors. He had a little garden where he planted vegetables, and he would go out every day to hunt for rabbits and catch fish. During the warm months, there was more than enough food to go around. But in the cold months it was very hard to keep his belly full. One cold winter night, the old man's stomach was growling, but there was nothing to eat in the cabinets but a few dried up potatoes. He stoked the fire in the fireplace to keep the cabin warm, and he eventually went to bed. As soon as he had dozed off, he was awakened by a strange noise in the room. He opened his eyes just in time to see a shadow creeping across the wall. When he sat up in bed and peered into the darkness, his eyes grew wide with terror. Sitting across the room from him was the weirdest looking creature he had ever seen. It was short and stubby, with pointed ears and glowing red eyes that seemed to burn with some strange fire. Its body was covered with a thick matted black fur, and it had big sharp claws and a long, thick tail. For a moment, Tom sat there, frozen in fear. He stared at the hideous creature, and it just stared back at him, none making a move. Then, quick as a flash, he grabbed his hunting knife and lunged at the creature. It sprang up and scurried out the hole in the floor it had clawed its way into. This thing was fast, but so was Tom. A split second before it escaped, he brought his knife down squarely on its long tail and cut it off. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech and disappeared into the night. Old Man Tom was left standing there with a long, thick tail in one hand and a bloody knife in the other. His stomach began to rumble again just as he was about to throw the tail outside. He was famished with hunger, so he decided to clean, cook, and eat it. It tasted a bit strange and was very chewy, but there was a lot of it, and Old Man Tom wouldn't go to bed hungry. Once full, he covered the hole in the floor this creature had crawled through and went back to bed. He hadn't been asleep very long before he was awakened again by a strange noise. It sounded like something trying to scratch its way into the cabin. The old man thought that if he stayed very quiet, whatever was making the sounds would go away. He heard it scratch and scratch, but then a strange voice hissed. "Te-lipo, te-lipo. I want my te-lipo." He thought he must be imagining things, but he heard it again. "Te-lipo, te-lipo. I want my te-lipo." Old Tom jumped out of bed, ran to the door and threw it open. He called out to his dogs. "I know. You know. Calico. Get over here." The dogs came tearing up to the cabin and ran around, barking, sniffing and snarling, but couldn't find anything. After looking around for a bit more, Tom eventually went back to bed. Just as he dozed off, he was awoken by the same scratching again. This time it sounded like it was coming from the window. Whatever it was, it really, really wanted to get in. The scratching stopped and he heard the same hissing again, but this time a little louder. "Te-lipo, te-lipo. Where is my te-lipo?" Old Tom, who wasn't frightened easily, was getting a little shaky. This was getting very weird. So he crept over to the window and called out, "I know. You know. Calico. Get over here and catch whatever's scratching on my house." The 3 dogs bounded up to the porch and sniffed and barked and sniffed, but again, found nothing at all. Tom decided to stay up the rest of the night to protect himself, his dogs, and his little cabin. So he pulled up a chair next to the fireplace, grabbed a blanket from the bed and settled in for the rest of the wind-chilled winter night. Sleep soon overtook him and he dozed off. It was almost dawn when Tom woke with a fright. The scratching seemed to come from every corner of his cabin. He searched frantically for his axe, his rifle, or anything he could use to protect himself, but was so overcome with terror that he couldn't find anything. The scratching grew louder and louder. Talipo, Talipo. Give me back my Talipo. Tom yelled back, leave me alone, I ain't got your Talipo. He then called his dogs, but this time they didn't come. He waited and waited, but still, not one dog came. Tom had never been so scared in his life. He ran to his bed and jumped in. The scratching and voice grew louder and louder. Talipo, Talipo. Give me back my Talipo. Tom yelled back out as loud as he could, I ain't got no Talipo, so why don't you leave me alone and go away? The scratching seemed to be inside the cabin with him now, and the scream was almost deafening. Talipo. Talipo. You took my Talipo and now I'm here to get it. Give it to me now. Tom pulled the cover up over his head and stayed as quiet as he could, but the scratching was now in his room. Talipo. Talipo. Give me back my Talipo. Tom then felt the thing scratching up the bottom of the bed and onto the cover. He eased the cover down to see what was approaching. Then he saw it, the same short, stubby creature with pointed ears, long claws and bloodshot glowing red eyes that seemed to burn straight through him. The creature pounced on his chest, looked straight down at him and said, You got my Talipo, and you better give it back now. Tom yelled, I ate it. I ate your Talipo. It's gone. The creature began to scratch and claw and tear away poor old Tom, trying to get the Talipo back. He tried to fight back, but the thing was too strong and the claws were too sharp. Tom's screams echoed throughout the dark woods and then suddenly stopped, leaving a chilling silence. A month or two had passed without hearing from Old Man Tom, and people from the nearby town began to get worried and went out to search for him. They hiked up through the forest and eventually reached his cabin. They found it completely abandoned and no sign of Tom or his dogs, and sadly were never seen again. They say that if you are all alone in those woods on a cold winter night and you listen carefully, you can hear a strange voice calling out, Talipo. Talipo. Now I've got my Talipo.